Cool. Okay. Well, we might as well start then. So, hi everyone, and thanks for coming. Very excited today to welcome Victoria Hayward to us, very own Black Library author in the flesh, as it were. There. Victoria is an author whose publication track record encompasses science fiction, fantasy novels, short stories, scripts, and articles. She was a member of the writing team for the award-winning 40k Dark Tide video game, which, by the way, guys, is very good if you've not played it already. I might have to chat with some of you about that. It's a very good game. I like it very long. So she was on the writing team for that. She has an MA in history from the University of Nottingham and was an invited contributor to the 2021 Anthem Press anthology, Trouble Writing in an Age of Global Quarantine. She's a guest lecturer at Lancaster University's Creative Writing MA and recipient of a PhD fellowship at Lancaster University. So she's going to be coming to my university very soon. So very excited about that. Victoria's also been supported by the Arts Council to develop her creative practice for both her written and visual artworks. She's also, most importantly of all, author of Deathworlder. Before she starts, has anyone here read Deathworlder? Yeah. Good, yeah, so we've got a good few people in the room who've read Deathworlder, so we've got an audience who's aware of your work. So without further ado, I'll mute this and I'll pass over to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind welcome and thank you for having me along. And hello from sunny Nottingham. And it is actually sunny here. I was going to say that as a joke, but we've got nice weather here in the home of Warhammer. So as Mike said, I'm here specifically to talk about my experience as a creative practitioner of writing in the Warhammer 40k setting. And I think the diversity of papers being presented over these few days illustrates really well the complexity of material and the diversity and richness that we authors are working with, decades and decades worth. So today, I'd like to speak a little about my approach to that and the thought process behind my characterisation and world building when I was writing my first Black Library novel, Deathworlder, along with some reflections as to how I approach writing Catachans and Tyranids. You've had a bit of an introduction to myself already from Mike, but I started writing for Black Library about 5 years ago. But when I first walked into Warhammer store, that was about 20 years ago now. And it was when Games Workshop had started producing the Lord of the Rings game. So I went in for your classic elves and riders of Rohan and so on, but was immediately confronted with 40k, which is visually very different. We've got demons and chains and mad gothic tanks with candles and pipe organs. We've got witch hunters and space marines and cathedrals flying through space. And in the store, they're playing cool music. Everyone's very friendly. There's a guy making a giant out of lots of little zombies. In short, I was hooked and the rest is kind of history. And a little disclaimer now before we get into the talk a bit more. I'm very much going to be sharing my own reflections as an individual author. I obviously don't speak for Games Workshop or Black Library. I'm a single freelancer. There are, of course, many perspectives on all of this, and mine is just one. But I hope it will be of interest to have a little window via my experience and approach. Now, for those of you who haven't read Deathworlder, I hope this will encourage you to pick it up, but do be aware there will be some spoilers. The background is it's Tyranid versus Catachans and one plucky Cadian. And to set the scene a little more about what the book is and to give you a bit of a feeling for what it's about, it's a war story at the end of the world, following a small squad of soldiers on a mission across a planet that's trying to eat them alive. They've got one last chance to do something meaningful before they and everything else on the world is devoured. The skies above them are writhing with deadly Xenos, and the dust of once magnificent cities chokes the air around them. The glittering ruins of a society that summoned down its own destruction. And for those of you familiar with 40k, which I'm assuming is absolutely everybody here today, this story starts where most other stories in the setting stop. We are well into the Tyranid planetary consumption phase from page 1 in this book. Okay, so let's start zoomed out and think about writing in the 40k setting itself. It is so rich. There are decades and decades worth of dozens and dozens of people's art, rules and sculpts to look at. So approaching that corpus as a creator is a very big job. Luckily, there are many pathfinders to help you do that because, of course, as well as the Black Library editorial team, who are absolutely fantastic, everyone who's written in that setting that I've encountered has been enormously collegiate and generous with their time. And the Black Library author community and wider Warhammer community is superb, and I've absolutely benefited from the support and guidance of them. And so is the Warhammer World Museum. It's one of the benefits of being local that I can go and look at what would these things actually look like together, and get ideas from the dioramas there. So that's a really nice tangible way of sort of accessing the setting too. Now, thinking about the setting itself, I think there are two halves to representing this. So one half is the flavour, so the feeling and the vibe of 40k, the aesthetic and so on. And I think this is a bit instinctive. We know when it's wrong when we look at it. So for example, if we see a super clean and futuristic looking ship interior with no skulls, we know that doesn't feel right if it's supposed to be an Imperial Navy vessel, for example. Now, the other half is what I would call the texture. So that's the actual type of story that we're selling. Yes, that's correct, Dortal, which is grimdark. And it's a very interesting space to be working as an author, because the stories don't need to work like regular stories. We can work outside of normal structures and to some extent archetypes. Efforts aren't required to be paid off. Loyalty or bravery aren't always rewarded, and happy endings are unusual. I always have to check over my work to make sure it's horrible enough once I've written the first draft. And I've got a practical example of this from Deathworlder, of making sure I've paid what I call the grimdark price. So in my original plan for the book, one of the main squad members was going to die at the close of the book. And I was partway through writing and I realised I wanted them to survive. I just didn't want to kill that person off. But in order to balance that, because that would be too much of a happy ending, I had to kill off two other people who were supposed to survive. Now, nobody told me to do that, but in my heart, I knew that this was the grimdark price, and it was what the story needed if it was going to feel like a proper part of the setting. And thinking about the markers of the setting again, when we're talking about the context of grimdark within 40k, I think one of the reasons it's so fun to write is because everything is so heightened. It's such a big, grandiose setting of extremes. You have the chance as a creator to be really maximalist, whether that's via the emotional experiences that you put your characters through or the staging of your stories. You're able to play with some really interesting stressors and situations for your characters that I don't think really exist elsewhere. And speaking about the characters, let's think about Catachans for a bit, which are one of the main factions represented in the book. Now, given this is a Warhammer conference, I feel pretty confident in saying that we all probably know what a Catachan looks like. Everyone in the room and online, if somebody gave you a big knife and a bandana, I bet you could all do a pretty good impression of a Catachan. But to sustain multiple Catachan point of view characters throughout a novel, we need more than that to bring them to life. We need an internal life for them and a ground in culture and society. So what does that look like? Well, I obviously did a lot of reading and hoovered up everything I could about Catachans and more broadly about jungle warfare, the relationship of humans with predators and so on. But the key way that I approached thinking about my characters was to triangulate the impression we have of Catachans now with what we know about where Catachans came from. Because Catachans didn't start as Catachans. They started as regular people who really didn't want to be on the planet that we now know as Catachan. They were settlers who found themselves in a really unexpected situation on a world that was trying to kill them. They did not sign up for that. They were not expecting that. But it was the descendants of these survivors who became the Catachans that we know and love today. And it was that last part that I ended up thinking about a lot, where we started and where we got to and what possible evolution could have happened in between. Now, consider these settlers who woke up to find themselves on this nightmare jungle planet where everything's poisonous or trying to eat you, or frequently both. What kind of people does that grow? And it seemed to me that from the start, to survive on Catachan, you'd have to rely on each other. It was always going to be them against the jungle. You're not all going to survive, but if you want your people to live on, you have to look out for each other. There's not space to be selfish or to put yourself first. And this is actually akin to a concept in cultural anthropology called a leveling mechanism. And it's a practice in some cultures to manage people within a community who begin to consider themselves better or above the rest of that community. Basically, if you get too big for your boots, you'll be dealt with. You don't get to endanger your people through selfishness or ego, or to place yourself above them. And in my short story Nightsider Imperialis, which features some of the same characters as Deathworlder, that's exactly what happens with the Catachan squad as a practical example of this. So with my idea about this quite egalitarian and pragmatic underpinning in mind, I can see the ways in which this might manifest, how this might look in terms of interactions with other people. And it made sense to me as to why Catachans famously don't get along with commissars, because the commissar's power is granted via rank, not earned in the same way that Catachan officers have to earn command by being elected on proven merit by their peers. And logically, that suggested to me that Catachans would find the practice on some worlds of officers inheriting their positions being suspect. And that's another tension that's quite fun to explore in terms of interactions with other regiments. And if you've read the book, you'll see how this manifests with the integration of Andits the Cadian into the squad. One of the other things I thought about as well was how Catachans might think of themselves and their own understanding of how they came to be Catachan. I imagine that the original event that left them stranded on Catachan would be very significant to them. A lot of people wouldn't have survived during the time the settlers were figuring out how to live on Catachan. For example, whichever poor person first tried to find out whether barking toads were edible, and all the people within a large radius around them. They're still part of the Catachan story, though, and without them, the settlers wouldn't have learned how to survive. Ooh. Hello, I think I've just dipped back out. I think I'm back for you. And when you go through something as horrific as the settlers did as a community, you make that mean something and you make that into legend. And we know that Catachans have got legends and a history of folk heroes because we know about Sly Marbo. And to me, that suggested a rich culture of oral history. So record keeping on paper was likely going to be a challenge in the early days of this world, which is why it would be important to tell stories and legends and create a sense of who they are and who they're becoming. This is the idea of where Catachan poetry came from that I mentioned in Deathworlder. And I should say up front that you don't get to hear any. And that was very intentional. It was something that I wanted to leave to people's imagination and allow readers to bring their own histories and cultural contexts and ideas of what that might look like to it. And the final big thing I thought about was how Catachans might feel about their planet. Now, in the 40k setting, it is vanishingly unlikely that once you leave your world as a soldier, you'll ever get to return. So how does that feel when your planet has made you in such a tangible way as Catachan has made Catachans? Yes, everything is trying to kill you in horrific ways all of the time. And yes, even the climate is poisonous, but you wouldn't be you without it. It will have been a constant participant in your life until the day that you leave. You will feel its absence every day you're away from it because it's a part of you. You'll feel the presence of the jungle on whatever grey, dark hive world you're fighting on. When you sleep, will you dream of the green filtered light and the living scent of the forest's leaves that you'll never see again? I think that's really poetic to think about, and it prompted me to consider a beautiful concept in Welsh about Wales, which has got no direct translation into English, called hiraeth. That roughly means a heart sickness for your homeland, a yearning and sadness for something forever lost in time and place. And there's a deep wistfulness to that, which I could imagine might sit within many Catachans, the sense of loss of a part of yourself, that the rest of your life will be lived without a world which you'll have been in dialogue with since the day you were born. Now, I will caveat all of this by saying that in amongst this quite in-depth consideration that I did, we have got probably my favourite character in the book, which is Trooper Falca Adair. She's kind of probably the platonic ideal of a Catachan at surface level. She's a big dumb jock who teases her squad mates a bit too much and tells really bad jokes throughout the book. But she's also fiercely loyal and can rip a Tyranid in half with her bare hands. So I do like to think that within the novel we've got the best of Catachan in all of its forms. Okay, so we've spoken about Catachan a bit. I'd now like to turn to the business of Tyranids. They are both the main adversary for our squad and kind of the setting of the book as well. Because of where we are in the consumption phase, the whole planet itself is kind of becoming a Tyranid thing. And having just told you about the quite immersive and empathetic approach I took to Catachans, I can tell you that I did the opposite with the Tyranids, and I tried to think about them as little as possible. Now, I'm being a little facetious for effect, but it's not too far from the truth. And that's because for me, the most interesting and frightening and exciting thing about the Tyranids is that they are incomprehensible. I wanted every time we encountered one to feel like we were seeing a Tyranid for the first time. I never wanted them to feel familiar. I never wanted our characters to understand their objectives. I wanted our characters to be horrified by their willingness to obliterate themselves and to devour each other. You can't reason with them. They don't don't fit into any frameworks of understanding that we have for other enemies. Now, coming back to the initial brainstorming of the novel, as soon as I knew that I could have Tyranids as an adversary, I was thinking about the setting of the planet and what that might look like. And I wanted the world to have once been very beautiful, but to have fallen into a state of terrible disrepair by the time the story is kicking off. I also don't believe that we've previously had a novel set entirely during the consumption phase. I really loved Adrian Tchaikovsky's Day of Ascension. I'd recommend it to everyone to pick up that novella. And it made me really curious to explore what might happen next. How might cults react when they see the reality of their angels, for example? In addition, I thought it would also give us some opportunities to explore some really gross things in a new format, such as, what if the actual air is eating you alive at this stage? The whole planet's digesting everything, being transformed into a huge suggestive machine. Everything is going to be so thick with xenospores that's going to start causing you some pretty nasty problems. This scenario also allows us to put some real pressure on the characters. There is no deadline, like within a few days this planet will be a barren rock kind of deadline. And there's also something perversely fun about picking up a story where most others finish. In Deathworlder, the Tyranids have won. The fighting is pretty much over. There's no meaningful resistance. Most of the people already dead. The settlement's destroyed. So we've got this feeling that we're sort of backstage after hours. The show's over. Nobody's supposed to be here seeing this bit where the Tyranids are just mopping up the last specks of biomass. But we get to stay and watch what happens. Texture and atmosphere are things that I really enjoy writing very much, and imagining something beautiful or terrible, ideally both. And I guess it's a bit like the romantic concept of the sublime, the fear and awe at the vast power and grandeur in nature and the overwhelming sensation it generates. Except instead of Vesuvius erupting, we have endless seas of Tyranids swarming across the world, grotesque and multitudinous and unstoppable in endless variations. And the vast power of that is overwhelming. The flows of obliteration, unthinking and absolutely uncaring. And how do you possibly reckon with that or confront that as a single human body with a frail human mind? So yes, I didn't want to give our human characters too much that they could hook onto that would feel familiar about their adversary. The only lens that we really have into Tyranids are the frameworks of understanding that the gene stealer cultists put up around them. But of course, this is going to be passed through a human brain. They're never really going to have a full picture of what the hive mind really wants. And at the end of the novel, our characters are literally falling apart, both mentally and physically, and it kind of moves from psychological horror to body horror, which I hope keeps that strangeness and fear fresh when you're reading. Okay, I've spoken about writing Warhammer, Catachans and Tyranids, and I think I'd like to close by drawing us back to one of the aims of the conference, which is to celebrate Warhammer. And I'd like to do that by saying a few words about my experience of existing and writing within the Warhammer community itself. Now, I mentioned at the start that I walked into a Warhammer store about 20 years ago and first encountered 40k, and I've got a visual aid for you here. This is a relic that I pulled out of a skip when the Upper Borough Wool store in Bath was being refitted, and it's moved house with me about 3 times. And it's something that's really precious to me because it's part of the fabric of that space that I first went into. And it's a reminder that the hobby itself is a space where we create friendships and where we're creative and we can tell stories and sharing something together. What I couldn't have known 20 years ago when looting that skip was that the people I met in that store would remain some of the most important people in my life today. That I'd moved to Nottingham and that I would find so many amazing friends because of Warhammer, that my first published work as an author would be because of Warhammer, and that I would have some of the most amazing encounters with strangers because of Warhammer. And I can't not mention the amazing readership, the Black Library author community and cosplayers who are so enthusiastic and genuine and always let me have a go on their chainswords or guns, which I really appreciate and always enjoy. But I wanted to mention a couple of the more striking encounters that I've had just to illustrate the reach and diversity of that shared world. The Lizardman player who was working at a bar in Venice and made me one of the best cocktails I've had in my life. The Blood Angels player who was a medieval knight who brought me behind the scenes at a joust to meet his horse Charlemagne. And the Eldar player who was a falconer and gifted me a feather from a golden eagle. All of these moments and these connections wouldn't have happened without the hobby that we share. And when you write for Warhammer 40k, you're not writing for strangers, you're just writing for friends you've not met yet. And one last thought to close. I've seen an image doing the rounds of a screen grab from the Space Marine 2 video game, where somebody who's new to the setting is encountering a cyber cherub for the first time and going, "What on earth is that?" And it made me smile very much, because that moment is kind of magic, I think. It brings me back to the moment that I first stepped into a store and was captivated by the setting and the community. And to everyone encountering 40k for the first time, I say, come in and enjoy the grimdark. You don't know what adventures it might take you on. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. Hopefully I'm muted just in time for you to hear the applause there. That was a fantastic talk.
Thank you, everybody.
Victoria. We've just got a few minutes. We've got a few minutes. I did see it in the chat there. Someone was really interested in the point you raised around the research process to writing, and I wondered maybe if you could tell us a bit more about sort of the steps you took. You said you spoke to some authors, did you? You were talking about Warhammer World, you said?
Yeah. So it's kind of my research process is quite quite big, so I tend to just expand out and zoom into everything. So obviously we've got any existing literature we can get the hands on. I tend to dive back as far as I can go and kind of look at everything, see how it's evolved, look at the obviously codexes, any novels, any shorts. Where I can, I'll speak to people that were involved in it. So I'm very lucky to have Gav Thorpe as my writing mentor, who was involved obviously in 3rd edition, and was a great person to talk to. And I was like, Gav, how, doing this background reading, I'm thinking really seriously about how people would exist and survive, like logistically on Catachan, because everything's poisonous and venomous and everything's like carnivorous. So how does that work? And he was like, sorry, gonna have to figure that one out. So yeah, and that's part of the fun sort of bombastic nature of the setting, I think. So yeah, so reading everything I can get my mitts on, having a look at the miniatures. So I've got, you probably won't be able to see her, but this is a Ripper Jackson that I painted. And it's just all part of kind of getting in that headspace. But then obviously outside of all of the kind of stuff within the setting, I do try to read a lot sort of holistically. So I did do a lot of reading around sort of jungle warfare and kind of practicalities around that. So, some of the gross stuff I'm getting ideas from real life. Also going to places that feel environmentally kind of inspirational. So I love going down to the Eden Project and the Lost Gardens of Heiligen. So being in amongst big weird foliage and sort of kind of going in amongst the leaves and the humidity and stuff. So yeah, it tends to be quite big and chaotic the way that I approach stuff, but hopefully it all works out in the end.
Yeah, no, I think it certainly did. I mean, it's a fantastic adventure story, really, like a sort of quest narrative.
Thank you.
This dying world. Some of the language in there as well. I just have to. When the first time I read your book, the phrase "encephalic harvest." Like I read a lot of books in my time, and I had never encountered that phrase before. And I did have to do a double take, and I went back to it at the end, and I messaged you. Said, what page is it on? I need to put it to
Thank you.
Both gross, yeah, but also sort of telling of the sort of absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
You mentioned gaps, actually, and I just wanted to maybe ask you about that just to close up here, because we've just come off a panel in which our speakers were talking about the deliberate gaps left in the storytelling, and you said just then about how Gav said to you, well, you just have to figure it out yourself.
Yes.
How did you find that process? Did you intentionally try to fill in gaps, or were you obviously aware that maybe you do need to leave some gaps for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so there's a couple of bits. I guess let's talk about gaps generally first, and I'll talk specifically about the story. So I guess you could say that the poetry, Catachan poetry, is an example of a gap, I guess, because I didn't want to define what that was. That's a bit different, I think, to talk about the setting specifically, because I don't know, hopefully everyone here has read Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, and if you haven't, I enormously recommend it. It's my favourite book in the world. I read it again and again and again, and I think one of the things that Anne does very well is kind of giving us the shape of things without pinning it down. And she does it in such an elegant way. And I think that's a really beautiful thing about her world building. So there's a scene where she's talking about people eating. And obviously there's many kind of culturally specific ways in which we participate in sort of communal dining and all the trappings that go with it. So like, you know, what's a fish slice? We know about the sort of order of cutlery and all that sort of thing. But as soon as you start pinning that down in a secondary world, then you're kind of imposing ideas, specific ideas about what that looks like. And we'll go, oh, well, that maps onto this. But what Anne did in this scene, which I really love, is just refer to the cutlery they're using as a utensil. So that could be anything, right? So we don't, it's not tying it down. It allows us to kind of participate. And I thought that was really lovely. And that was sort of partly the thinking behind the poetry. So it's kind of that sense of not wanting to tie it down because that sort of makes it too specific, but it's that sort of subtle allowing us to participate, which I really, really like. In terms of the sort of setting, I think probably what I did was expand on what we know is there rather than kind of look for stuff that we maybe have other questions about. So I guess, you know, the example of that is looking at what we know, which is where Catachan started and where they got to, and it's asking about the questions in between. So I think that was probably the way that I kind of approached it. It was a sort of exploring the richness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but very much, very much so. Really, really fascinating. I'm going to sort of slightly adjust the question that Patrick's posed over the side because it fits with a lot of things we've been talking about. So evil, I think, horror, nastiness is the Imperium evil, sort of themes we've all been talking about over the last 2 days. And there's a question there from Patrick talking about what the Tyranids are. The Tyranids really worse than the Imperium in a way? Because at least the Tyranids aren't lying to you about what they're going to do to you.
Yeah, and I think that was. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Go on.
No. Yeah. So I was just going to ask you a bit about what you thought about when you were depicting the Tyranids. Whether in relationship to the Imperium, perhaps, what did you go to sort of deliberate lengths to depict a sort of horror to the Imperium as well as to the situation as well as to the Tyranid?
Yeah, and I think you can think of this at different levels. So obviously most of the book, we've just got this small group of people left. So it's like their individual response to what they're seeing. And I think to see, you know, for me, the true horror in all of these things is like one person, and it's this sublime thing again, which is hard to do when it's like big faction versus big faction. So I kind of want to just go, how does this feel for this one person standing in front of the swarm? But also, yes, we've got, if you've read it, the planet that I destroy in the book was once a very beautiful thing, but beneath that there is absolute horror. So they've got these big moth farms on the world, and there's reference, the kind of Catachans are talking to the cultists about how, well, sorry, we've come to your planet and it's an absolute nightmare because of the way that the farms work. People survive only a few months, their legs are rotting off because of all the moth poo, and it's like, it's really, so it's just as horrible for those people. And I think that's something that Adrian depicted really well in his Ascension Day book, and it's that sense of like, yeah, the Imperium's a nightmare. Yeah, good. I can see why people are going, yeah, the Genestealer cult's pretty nice and pretty friendly, and they're all sort of, you know, much more positive than you. And I think the way he writes that POV is fantastic. And again, I'd really recommend that everybody read it. I think it's so interesting. So yeah, hopefully it's horror at all levels, but with the experience, obviously, the individuals in this book, the focus is on, oh my God, I'm melting and I'm going to be eaten.
Yeah, I think that's what's so powerful about so much of the Black Library material that's out there, isn't it? It's the focus on the individual human experience in this world of horror that besets you on all sides. And as Ian says there in the chat, all hail the four-armed emperor.
Absolutely, yeah. We're all on the side of the four-armed emperor because he's probably dialed in and listening. So we need to go careful.
Perhaps so. Yeah, so I'm aware that we're just at the end of our time today. I've already had some really positive comments in our WhatsApp chat. I'll share them with you later.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for spending the time to speak to us today. And we really, really appreciate having you here. Just on behalf of myself, conference organisers, everyone in the room, thank you so much. And it's honestly brilliant book. Go buy it. It's really good. Read it.
Oh, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Best of luck with your future writing endeavours and your PhD.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a lovely day, everybody. Thank you. Bye.